So how do you maintain this garden?
In different ways, Sarah. Um, the first thing that I like to say is, because we're trying to make it look intentional, that I like to come out and trim around the edges and weed where the weeds have gotten a little bit thick, because I want it to look like that it's meant to be this way, right? And I want the neighbors, again, we're an ambassador, and so I want the neighbors to understand that this is intentional, that it's thought through, and it can still look beautiful. I balance, and that includes also, let me say this, trimming back at certain times of the year to promote growth. So as spring moves on, I'll sort of cut back some of the dead stems and so forth so that the roots can kind of regenerate. In the fall, sometimes I'll trim back. As certain plants go to seed, depending on whether it's perennial or annual, I might cut back, which will actually stimulate growth. But there are some things that you need to weigh against that. So, for example, if it's very early spring and there's almost nothing else for pollinators to feed on, for nectar sources, I'm not going to pull out those weeds. So I'll leave, little wildflowers around so that they have something to feed on. So you have to balance it, because remember, what's the point of a wildscape? To support wildlife. So that's the primary thing. And then it's just education, letting people know, there are some weeds here, but there are some plants that most people identify as weeds, but the reason for that is these critters need to eat. And maybe I'll, rotate around those later on. The other thing is that many of our native bees, in fact, most of our native bees are what we call solitary bees. Solitary bees don't they don't make nests as a colony, and they don't make hives like honeybees. And so where do they nest? About 70% of them or so dig tunnels in the earth, and they lay their eggs in there. And about 30-ish% will actually use either the pithy stems of spent plants or wood, and use their mandibles and make tunnels and lay their eggs in there. So there are some bees, especially the really tiny native bees, that actually use dead stems for their nesting tubes. So what happens if, after a freeze over the winter, we just hack back all that dead plant? If we do that, we are potentially cutting away and killing baby bees. So it's an education thing. In flyers that we have for our St. Julian's Crossing area, and in conversations I have with the neighbors, I let people know that in the winter, after freezes, they're going to see dead stalks in my garden. Why? Because I'm not going to cut them back when there are potentially baby bees in there waiting to hatch in the spring. And so I won't cut back those pithy stems from plants until we're fairly far along in about halfway through the spring or end of the early spring. So again, the primary focus is to maintain the garden to support wildlife, but you have to balance that against the fact that you live in a community and you want it to look intentional. Does that make sense? So that's another way I maintain it. One other tip that I have is that, generally speaking, you want to really pay attention to the water requirements of plants when you buy them or get them from other people. You kind of want to put similar water needs in the same bed, if at all possible, so that one doesn't get dried out too much while the other one's thriving, or the one that is more drought tolerant ends up getting root rot because it's next to something like a Turk's cap or whatever that needs a little more water. Same as you do for sun, same as you do for soil. That said, even within those that are all drought tolerant, there are some that are more than others. Just depends. Deeper roots, different chemistry, whatever. So watering by hand allows me to spot check that way.